First thing I want to make perfectly clear is that this is not a full lesson. The most important thing. That's what everything else is building up towards. And so with some forms like geometric forms, it's relatively easy once you get your angles correct to give that sense that it's three-dimensional, but when you start looking at curves and organic forms and anything like that, it starts to break down a bit. And so you need to go back and reinforce it with tools like contour lines and uh, a lot of beginners will look to shading. Really clear, it's more subtle, and so you have a bit of a hierarchy of how you want to go about depicting that form. So the first and most important element is the silhouette. So that would be if I just, hold on, let's see if I can do this. If I simplify it to just this block, and this shadow, this cast shadow here is not helping at all, because it's not actually part of our silhouette of the form itself. So if you get a silhouette, something like this, your gut instinct is to interpret this as a 2D form. But if you start carving those edges, so that you start depicting just how the form turns in space, you can actually start conveying the idea that this isn't just two-dimensional. And it's subtle things, but it's the first thing that your eye will see in the drawing. And what your eye sees first will have the greatest impact. The problem with shading is that your eye sees that very late in its how the forms themselves exist. Form are pointing towards the light source and some are pointing away. So the ones that point towards the light source catch the light, and the ones geometric ones. This one extends as well from organic forms in that it's these sort of flat forms that flow through 3D space. So when we think of flat, we usually think of, well, it's just going across a flat 2D page, right? But that's not the case. These are flowing from being further away from the viewer to closer to further, and so they are flat shapes, but they're still flowing through a three-dimensional world. And so you first got this ribbon here. I probably shouldn't have overlapped the different shapes this much because it's kind of confusing, but this ribbon, and it's actually one of the things that we deal with in the second lesson, that the ribbon kind of is an extension, or not extension, a simplification of the same kind of challenges we deal with when we draw things like leaves, which are very simple concepts of if you have a line that goes from being further away to closer, started with all these different challenges of figuring out mislead. The problem is that you're tackling multiple challenges all at once. So if you do something like that, and seeing me do it is a little bit misleading because my brain, since I've practiced drawing these sorts of center lines and using them, my brain automatically thinks about flow and all these things at the same time, which eventually your brain will do as well. But when you start out, your brain is kind of bombarded with all breaking everything down into smaller steps, smaller forms, smaller challenges. And so the first thing you want to deal with here is that you want to draw your center line, the sign, the flow of the leaf, and then you want to construct the leaf shape itself around that. And then you might add a little bit more information. So say some basic contour lines to describe the form and how it it distorts through space, and then you might have little edge deformation or maybe wavy edges, something like that. And you can add all sorts of detail after the fact, but the point is that you're working off a basic framework or a scaffolding. Like when you construct a building, you don't just build it up from the ground and with brick by brick. You build the scaffolding and the supports on the interior and the exterior, and then you build up the main building itself and eventually take that scaffolding down. In this case, we don't take the scaffolding down because I always recommend that people work in ink, so you can't erase that. But the main thing to remember here is that we aren't after pretty drawings. We're not doing any of this to draw a beautiful drawing so we can pin it on our fridge. Holding too early, you're going to miss out on a lot. And so first thing you can see is that I've drawn on we are going to start off with a basic leafy plant image, and we're going to talk about how the constructional method gets applied to this. So first thing you can see is that I've drawn on top of it, and that's not good. Let's just switch it to red because that's going to be more visible. That's a little better. So here you can see that I fleshed out my pot, and it's very similar to a cylinder. It's actually, you can look at it as a compound cylinder of one cylinder being here, another here, and so on. And the idea is that your cylinders don't have to be completely straight. They can taper, they can swell out, but the main structure of the cylinder, which you might actually want to look at the since none of my lessons actually explicitly talk about how to construct cylinders. 250, this 250 cylinder challenge here, which actually that structure. So anyways, that sort of structure is always going to be the same through all your cylinders. It's going to be evenly shaped on both sides, symmetrical. It'll be built around a minor axis, and so on and so forth. But you can actually still make it somewhat tapered. This is a huge exaggeration. Sorry for the sloppy line work, I'm just trying to get through this quickly. That's pretty bad. But they're still being aligned to the exact same minor axis. I don't know, trunk, which if you're aligned and to the exact same minor axis, which is definitely important when you want to work with cylinders. Anyways, so then you've got another cylinder right here, which, if you look closely, it's actually a bundle of these, I don't know, trunks or stems or whatever you want to call them, in construction. Now, things get a little bit tricky when you start looking at all of these freaking leaves and branches and whatever they are. So I've broken down a few of them, and you've got the center lines and whatever that I've drawn in, and I've built leaves around them like I showed before. And you'd basically do this for all of these leaves, although generally when I'm studying a plant, and you'd basically do this for around them, and you've got the center lines and whatever that I've drawn in, and then I've built leaves around them like I showed before. And you'd basically do this for all of these leaves, although generally when I'm studying a plant, I'm not going to be overly preoccupied with. I've broken down a few of them, and you've got the center lines and whatever that I've drawn in, and then I've built leaves around them like I showed before. And you'd basically do this for all of these leaves, although generally when I'm studying a plant, I'm not going to be overly preoccupied with reproducing the plant completely accurately. I'm more interested in learning how these things fit together, what kind of patterns that they follow, and whatnot, so that I can reproduce them, or so I can record that information in my brain and reproduce them at least somewhat faithfully from memory down the line if I have to. But of course, this is all still focusing on being done from observation, so we're not going to be relying on our memories right now. So the best way to depict how I use this kind of constructional information, this whole thing is not my study. This is just breaking down the forms. This is what I would do in my mind. And you can draw on top of the images if you want to, if you can. Like, you'd have to print them out for that, or do it digitally or whatever. But it's usually simple enough not to have to really draw it explicitly like this. You can see that. So this is let's start out my actual construction, and you'll notice that I did this at a different angle, a different perspective than the actual drawing. You don't have to do that. You can try and match what's in the image, and you might actually want to do that because it's a little simpler. But what I've done here shows that the understanding of construction will actually allow you to then manipulate the forms and put them at different angles, and just because you understand how it sits in space. So I've got my initial ellipse, or a tapered cylinder, and so forth. So ellipse, creating, or over here, where it's doing the opposite. And there actually is a little lip to this vase or pot or whatever, but I kind of skip that for now for simplicity's sake. But it's basically the same idea. You just be bulge and so forth. So you have thin. And so here, this forms in their entirety. They're less preoccupied. It can be capturing these things big as smaller 3 dimensions. Okay, the next point in the construction is going to be defining the center lines of your leaves. And in this case, there's a lot of them. And I actually haven't drawn all the ones that you might find in this image because I didn't want to. You would have cluttered the drawing, and it would have taken too long, and I have things to do. So the main thing to look at here is that I've drawn each one as a little arrow. And this is largely for my own sake, and it's also for the sake of demonstration. You don't have to do this, but what's important is that an arrow, your brain thinks of an arrow as being directional, which is super important. The second part is to acknowledge that this arrow is not flowing across the flat page again, but it is flowing through space. And you can also help capture this by using a little bit less pressure here, so your lines come out thinner, and then increasing as you go, so that the thicker edge feels like it's closer to the viewer. Or you might do the opposite. I mean, if your arrow is moving further away from the viewer. It's the same principle. Now, controlling your pressure like this can be difficult, especially at the beginning, and it's one of the tip. I don't know why I'm drawing. Add is going to get fatter to cause it to be a little bit tapered at the beginning, and initially you're going to have full on practice. Do practice that to capture pixels. These more nuance. There's so many leaves that are interacted with that. So back to our leaves. Once you've constructed all of these little center lines, you want to construct your leaves around them. And since there's so many leaves, it still feels a little bit overwhelming, but if you deal with each one at a time, it's much more manageable, and you can focus on the problem of, well, I've got my center line and I want to construct my leaf around it. And then from here you might go and add that extra detail or whatever it is. Like these have somewhat wavier lines, so you might do that. Is draw wavier lines, so you might do that. And you can always use line weight to help make these initial construction lines disappear, but what you don't want to do is draw the initial construction lines timidly. Because when you draw timidly, wavier lines, so you might do that. And you can always use line weight to help make these initial construction lines disappear, but what you don't want to do is draw the initial construction lines timidly. Because when you draw timidly, your lines are going to wobble, they're going to be faint, they're not going to be confident, and you want them to be confident. That's of the utmost importance. Every single line you draw should be, first you should think through whether or not you gain from drawing that line, and if you do, if it helps you understand the forms you're drawing or helps capture them, then you want to draw it with confidence. And that's where you're going to start improving, because at first, drawing with confidence, it's going to be undue confidence. You're not actually going to be able to draw that line very well. And then fail, your failures master what they do best. And then you how I do it. And yes, brain is the master for you, and you shouldn't be working against them. You should be trusting them to do what they do best. And then you're overthinking it, and your brain because you guys said fail our example to show you, and it'll be a quick one because this video is running really long. So the last one is a pomegranate plant. So I did the exact same thing here. I traced over it, and so you can see that I got a big sphere here, a cylinder, and some more cylinders. And you'll see in the lesson that there are some initial exercises about drawing these leaves with center lines, whatever, and also one for drawing tubes, which are, and so on and so forth. When you have, so the other thing here to be very aware of is that when you have two forms, that's a poor example. You can see that I'm drawing, this is a cylinder and this is a sphere, right? But the important thing to be aware of here is that this here is not just one end of the cylinder, it's the point of intersection, or the shape of intersection, the area of intersection between the cylinder and the sphere. Being aware of these points of intersection is super important. If you look at this pomegranate, the point of intersection is actually not visible. That's a poor color to use, it's not very visible either. So it's actually on the other side of it. So you have to have X-ray vision to actually see this. But since we understand that this is a cylinder and this is a sphere, that surface of the sphere, the aware of this is understanding how you're forming this bunch of 2D shapes. It's not very useful. If you were to just understanding how your forms are in fact three-dimensional. If you were to just draw this, that doesn't tell you anything. That's just a bunch of 2D shapes. It's not very useful. As soon as you add this intersection, you start to understand that, oh, this is a sphere, that its surface, even on the opposite side, leads up like this. And then maybe on the visible side, it goes up like that. And then this same kind of surface can be seen distorting onto the cylinder and going straight down. These are all important tricks to force your brain to think in 3 dimensions instead of just 2. Because it is a big challenge to get over the fact that you're drawing on a flat page, or like me, a flat screen, that you're around, or if you were modeling with clay or form, but you can't 3D objects. And here, I did the same thing as before. I drew my sphere of intersection, and it leads out into a, actually I drew a cylinder here, and then I drew a sort of, here I clearly drew it at a completely different angle, different to me. But not really, because you're looking at, and that sort of awareness, I do organic forms. I'll help because on every side of the form visible, that would be there. I always have one side of the form visible, the one being visible and one not. Like you'll see it a lot when I do the little bit not. I just drew it at a completely different angle, something like that. And here I've got another one of those invisible intersections, because here I clearly drew it at a completely different angle, different orientation. So this intersection, this line here, is actually visible to me. This one is not. Whereas in this case, it's almost barely visible, but not really, because you're looking at it straight on. This orientation is a little bit more dynamic. And that sort of awareness of the one being visible and one not, like you'll see it a lot when I do organic forms. I always have one side of the form visible, and then one side is not, like that would be there. It helps you maintain that illusion of 3D space, because if everything was 2D, you wouldn't see that end on your side. You would just see it straight and even. Like you're looking at it, like, yeah, it doesn't read terribly. But there are things that you want designing the more, you want to play with them. And so these are important. Read what I'm trying to communicate to the viewer. That's what I planned. I talked with you guys the first 2. These option on, I'm not terribly happy with these lessons. And
has to do with drawing leaves. Now, this is a pretty common thing that comes up with this topic of drawing line, and we want to do that from a starting point to an end point. We don't actually have to necessarily, but it's not that we're learning how to draw plants specifically, it's that we are trying to learn the concept of constructional drawing from this perspective of drawing plants. And as we move through the different lessons, it'll be more about changing the way we look at the same. The first exercise in lesson 3 has to do with drawing leaves. Now, this is a pretty common thing that comes up with this topic of drawing plants, but it's not that we're learning how to draw plants specifically, it's that we are trying to learn the concept of constructional drawing from this perspective of drawing plants. And as we move through the different lessons, it'll be more about changing the way we look at the same problem and attacking it from different angles and applying it to different subjects. But it's really all about learning the same topic, construction. And in this case, the construction of leaves is really about the construction of two-dimensional, not two-dimensional, but flat objects that exist and flow through 3D space. So we did tackle this a little bit with the arrows exercise in lesson 2, and we're essentially applying that concept to something more related to plants. This exercise has 3 different steps. First, we establish the flow of our leaf. Means setting down a single line, and we want to do that from a starting point to an end point. We don't actually have to necessarily that as a flow. You can think here in an organic fashion and eventually reaches this other point. Our leaves are very directional. They definitely have that sense of moving from one point to another, so this really helps capture the core of what they are. Once you have their flow down, you've already essentially solved the problem, answering resolved it. So you're essentially trying to just break it all down so that you can manage it. To resolve it. So you're essentially problem you don't, and then answering one question at a time, solving one small problem at a time, taking a complex problem, breaking it up into manageable chunks, handling them, moving from one point to another. So this really helps definitely have that sense of moving from one point to another. So this really helps capture the core of what they are. Once you have their flow down, you've already essentially solved the problem. And construction itself is really about taking a complex problem, breaking it up into manageable chunks, handling them one at a time, answering one question at a time, solving one small problem at a time. And then once you move on to the next stage, you've already solved that problem. You don't need to resolve it. So you're essentially you're trying to just break it all down so that you can manage it. Is to enclose your leaf here caught up the flow of a line. A line is usually one-dimensional, and it's running through 3D space, and then we are enclosing a two-dimensional shape around it. Lastly, would be the flow create something very pretty. They don't, but details are simple matters of like changing up your edge, well, not quality, but like adding a little bit of additional edge detail, like a wavy edge instead of something being completely straight and crisp. Maybe some little holes that have kind of worn into a drop. Although when it comes to varying your leaf's edges, there's a continuous wavy line because each ripple, each kind of outcropping here, each bump is a separate element. It exists separately. So this is one, this is another, and while they have some vague relation to each other, they are not the same bump. So you don't want to define them using the same line. You want to bump them all up individually so that you can control and design how that happens. Design is an important word because it really conveys the intent that you are supposed to have, whereas when you're drawing a single continuous wave, you lose a sense of conscious intent, and you end up like actually, if you're following the first point, it pretty much avoids the second, but I want you to keep using this edge, this simple edge here. This is one of the problems that you've already solved. I don't want you to draw as though you're ignoring it or using it as a vague, idea of what you're trying to follow. You've essentially established a piece of your scaffolding, and you need to adhere to it. To the edge, return to the same edge. Another edge is dipping below. Avoids the second, but you don't want your hand to do the thinking. Another issue is that people will actually, if you're following the first point, it pretty much avoids the second, but I want you to keep using this edge, this simple edge here. This is one of the problems that you've already solved. I don't want you to draw as though you're ignoring it or using it as a vague, idea of what you're trying to follow. You've essentially established a piece of your scaffolding, and you need to adhere to it. Notice how I'm drawing from this edge up into a bump and then back into the edge. I want to keep sticking to this thing. So even if I was dipping below, I'd still come back to match the exact same one. So you can go up from that edge, you can go down from that edge, but you always return to this. When you start drawing, you look at your piece of paper like it's just a flat page. And yes, technically that is exactly what it is. What yourself up is that you're in dimensional space, and the lines that they are curved from moving across the way. Right now, you're saying, well, line. You are selling anyway to build in 3D blades. Supposed to be closer. Still think there's in mind. I'm compressing that. I'm still thinking about that. Still thinking about the fact that they're come out effective. That it ends up being bigger and this end ends up being smaller. It comes out that needed. I don't think this end is closer to me and this end is farther away. So there's a bring up. You may feel worried that to let your lines overlap. So here in the middle, because it's right here, I have all kinds of them staying on one really form twist. Okay. And I was drawing So the next exercise that we're talking about is called the branches exercise. In it, we're going to be looking at a process that you can apply. It's essentially just another use of the construction method, just like the leaves exercise. And we're applying it here to learn how to go about So the next exercise that we're talking about is called the branches exercise. In it, we're going to be looking at a process that you can apply. It's essentially just another use of the construction method, just like the leaves exercise. And we're applying it here to learn how to go about tackling the sort of branch-like forms, like the kind of flowing tubes that we end up seeing a lot of when we're dealing with plants. You can see them in other objects too, like anything with piping or tubing or So the next exercise that we're talking about is called the branches exercise. In it, we're going to be looking at a process that you can apply. It's essentially just another use of the construction method, just like the leaves exercise. And we're applying it here to learn how to go about tackling the sort of branch-like forms, like the kind of flowing tubes that we end up seeing a lot of when we're dealing with plants. You can see them in other objects too, like anything with piping or slices. So basically ellipses, contour ellipses. It's similar to lesson 2 where we built the organic forms with contour ellipses, but in this we are actually working from inside out rather than creating the form, the outer kind of edges first and then filling them. Here we're building that structure up from the inside. So we want to just add. Now keep in mind that you want to watch out for, so we want to have our lines flow into one another. We won't end up with, or at least ideally we'll avoid ending up with any kind of stiff or approaching it with the most comfortable. So let's try that again. Put down so that we can get a comfortable process. Just keep pushing on forwards. You're going to have, it's not going to come out perfect. So while you being in mind how this object is, how this pipe is going to be, flowing through space. So while you will make mistakes, one that kind of didn't go perfectly is still usable. You can still kind of continue to push through to complete that drawing. Pushing on forwards, you're gonna, it's not going to come out. It can still come out fairly solid, even though you might have had a little bit of a chicken scratchy issue here or whatever. But it's still entirely usable for a drawing. Remember that all of our drawings in our Drawbox lessons are really just exercises. Come out perfectly in the end, it's a useless drawing. You make mistakes because you're gonna have or whatever. To kind of break this down again, line you over next don't size it and larger flowing force. Leaves and petals that they have a clear sense of directionality to them. And really that they're much more than just a static object with a clear starting point and an end point. It's not just, from here to here. It's a piece of a much larger flowing force. And so that's what we're trying to capture in how we draw these leaves and petals. And even if a petal doesn't have this kind of clear flow to it, like a clear directionality, even if it's a smaller petal, something like this, it still is very worthwhile to actually try and either find the flow that's pushing it or even invent it yourself. So if you can exaggerate a sense of flow to it, it can really help push the idea that this is a flat, flowing shape. And the last thing I wanted to say is you'll notice that I often draw these little arrowheads at the end of the lines that I draw when I'm doing my flow, and you'll see that in a lot of my other drawing demos. It's because it always reminds me that this is not the beginning and the end of this line. It is a representation of something that flows continuously. And it's just the visible part of it. So let's take this reference image and move it aside. So with these demos, I've drawn them all beforehand, and I'm just going to step through them, and we'll talk about what I'm doing, and it'll give me the opportunity to talk about certain decisions that I made and what I'm thinking about without at the same time trying to balance drawing it live. So to start with, this daisy clearly has a stem, and even though we can't see this stem through this section here, that doesn't mean that we don't have to be aware of it. We know, based on our logic and intuition, that this stem connects to a larger element from which all these petals come out. And so here I've drawn just how it's going to connect to this larger bulb, because there is a bigger form here, and we just want to make sure that we're connecting to it at a specific location. Construction is very much about not just drawing simple forms, but also understanding how they relate to each other. And so this contour ellipse here gives me a sense of grounding in terms of how the branch or stem that I'll be drawing here actually connects to the rest of it. And so next, using the branch method, which is from lesson 3. And so next, using the branch method, which is from the branches exercise earlier in lesson 3, we are going to construct the remainder of the stem. Now you'll see that this stem gets cut off here. And down here, I've capped it off with the ellipse. Never leave your three-dimensional objects just open-ended like this. If you do, it will just completely flatten out that form. So even if you have a cylinder here, and even if you have these contour curves or contour ellipses, if you leave this open, it's really going to undo a lot of what you're doing here, and you're going to be fighting against it. So just capping it off, even if it continues on below, you still want to give it a clean cut and then reinforce it by capping it off. And so just like in the branches exercise, we've constructed a series of ellipses, and then we've connected them by it was along a minor axis line. So each ellipse is aligned to this minor axis. And we're constructing it in segments. And we're constructing it in segments because we can control those segments better. But we have to make sure that we still draw these segments with a confident stroke. Plain connected because the was actually off. It was like that, or the off because your little arrowheads scattered is what's important. Of the and so in this next step, I am creating the bulb of the. You see a bunch of little bits here. I'll increase the size of this reference again. So you can see all these little things here, these little, I don't know what they are, probably they're seeds or pollen or something like that. And so there's a bunch, there's a lot going on here, but really it's arranged in one big ball or, hemisphere. So we can create this dome and just leave it like that for the time being. And you'll see that I created another contour ellipse along the top here. That is just to help reinforce the illusion of form. And so if I am drawing a ball, it's a lot like it. I can work with this because I myself believe that it is a sphere. And so if I were to draw anything along it, it's all going to run along the surface of that form instead of just running across it. So those little things that I do later, drawing a ball, it's a lot like it I can work with this because I myself believe that it is a sphere. And so if I were to draw anything along it, it's all going to run along the surface of that form instead of just running it. To draw anything along it, it's all going to run along the surface of that form instead of just running across it. So those little things that I do later on will help continually reinforcing the same illusion. But it does help still to draw contour lines along it to help reinforce that illusion now, so that if your belief in that illusion is not as strong as it could be, this will help remind you that you're drawing on a sphere, not on a two-dimensional circle or ellipse. And so these kinds of, it's kind of like a pole on a globe, where you may have a pole up here and then all your, I can never remember if it's longitude or latitude that goes down this way, but, and then this would be on the opposite side, which we cannot see because it's pointing away from us. This is pointing towards us. But it's like the poles on a globe, which help, even that tiny little contour ellipse will do so much to help build that illusion of form rather than 2D shape. Now I've drawn out all of my flow lines for these petals. Now we could have gone in and drawn a big encompassing ellipse to kind of define a big encompassing ellipse to kind of define the bounds of where we want to put these. Sometimes it can be helpful, other times I skip it. It's not always the most important thing, as long as you are used to keeping your flow lines a consistent distance, or at least as far away as they need to go. The real importance here still is how these lines flow. If you go through the trouble of defining your bounds, but then draw a bunch of lines that are just flat with shallow curves, that's not going to give you a very strong construction. But if instead you're drawing, even without those bounds, if you're drawing nice, curving, energetic, confident lines to define the flow, then you're going to be putting yourself in a much better position. So you can see that here, each one is smooth and confident, and I'm not stressing too much about reproducing this image. That's not what we're here to do. We're here to use this image as a subject matter through which to exercise and practice our construction skills. So if our result doesn't look just like this, that doesn't matter. And you'll find that my drawings rarely look just like my reference, because that's not what I'm striving to do. I'm striving to construct based on the information that I've given here. I'm more interested in how these forms relate to each other and how they exist in space than whether or not they're perfectly replicating this image. This really just gives us something to draw, and it gives us information that we don't necessarily start out with in terms of how all the components that exist in a flower and so on. And so now for each of these, each of these I have drawn a petal. Now I usually try and get the end of this petal to line up right with the end of the flow line. In many of these, I didn't actually manage that too successfully. I am still more interested in drawing those lines with the same kind of confidence and ghosting as is needed, but ultimately I would prefer for this to have ended at the end of the flow line. But at the end of the day, it's not that big of a deal. Just strive for it. Don't worry if you miss it. You'll notice here I've got these flow lines that curve around. Be mindful of the fact that this is where you're basically establishing that these petals and leaves, they fold over themselves. And so the way I drew these, if I draw a folding in here, I actually continued along like that. I bent them over as well, and then I bridged, well, in this case it would have actually been more like this. And I bridge this part here. So I'm not doing anything particularly fancy. I'm really just following my flow line as I always would. So don't let things fold over themselves. And in general, I do like to keep my leaves started at points, even if it's penetrating into this bulb here. I prefer not to leave them squared off like this or open. In general, it just contributes better to the sense of completeness and the leaf. And in general, I do like to keep my leaves started at points, even if it's penetrating into this bulb here. I prefer not to leave them squared off like this or open. In general, it just contributes better to the sense of completeness and the leaf being enclosed fully. So that's usually what I strive to do. And of course you should too. And so now I'm less worried about these details here, but I'm still going to drop them in. And so as you saw before, they were these little clusters of pollen, capturing these as simple lines running along. Additionally, you've got a lot of extra lines. And so I'm capturing these as simple balls for now. Additionally, you've got a lot of extra lines running along the surface of the form. These can be very useful because they give you additional contour lines to reinforce the overall construction. These should still be drawn with the same confidence and flow as that initial flow line. You're just reinforcing it even more, and that can help a lot. Don't allow yourself to get lazy and reinforce the overall construction. These should still be drawn with the same confidence and flow as that initial flow line. You're just reinforcing it even more, and that can help a lot. Don't allow yourself to get lazy and just do a stiff, simple line. Follow the flow and the surface of this form because you're really reinforcing that by creating these contour lines that will run along the surface, and by doing so, describe how that surface moves through space. And finally here, I've added detail. I'm going to remove the red because it's just kind of bad looking. But what I've done here is a few things. First of all, I'm using cast shadows to separate these forms where appropriate. Don't go overboard with that, and be careful of where you put it. Usually when I'm adding a cast shadow, I will use my regular pen to define its outline, and then I'll use a brush pen to fill it in, because brush pens fill the black in much more easily. Separate these four things. First of all, I'm using cast shadows to separate these forms where appropriate. Don't go overboard with that, and be careful of where you put it. Usually when I'm adding a cast shadow, I will use my regular pen to define its outline, and then I'll use a brush pen to fill it in, because brush pens fill the black in much more easily. You want to avoid a situation where you're getting outside the lines. I know that's kind of grade school, but try and stay, that's why we established the outline of our shadow, and then try and stay inside of it as best as you can, even though the brush pen might be a little bit more difficult to handle at first. And always still make those confident strokes, even if they're little. Confidence behind those strokes will make sense. That makes the reason that we want to fill it in with something like a brush pen to maintain smooth edges rather than little, choppy nonsense. That makes the smooth, even if they're, and always still make those confident strokes, even if they're little. Confidence behind those strokes will allow you to maintain smooth edges rather than little, choppy nonsense. That makes the edges of the shadow uneven. And so the reason that we want to fill it in with something like a brush pen or a thicker pen or whatever you have on hand, but the point is that we want to avoid situations where you are trying to do it with a narrow pen and you end up with a lot of very tiny specks of white. These little bits of white can be very distracting because they have a lot of contrast to them, a lot of white and black next to them, next to each other. And so that's going to call out to the viewer's eye. They're going to see all these white and black things very densely packed, and it'll draw their attention. And you want to be able to control exactly what is drawing the viewer's eye. So generally these things you want them to be solid black because that doesn't have any contrast to it. And so we're adding cast shadows. I'm fussing a little bit with texture. I'm really just implying that there's these little kind of ridges on the petals that flow in the direction of the flow line here. I also added little kits. Basically, anything you can see on here, don't go overboard. Because if you start fussing too much with your texture, you're really there's a lot of opportunities where you can contradict what you've put down in your construction. At no point should your texture ever contradict what you constructed and what these construction lines you put down are suggesting. Remember that construction is basically a series of answers to spatial questions. So for example, how far out does this leaf go? Well, it goes all the way out to here. We've decided that from this flow line. And so when I draw that leaf, I'm not drawing it like this because the question was already answered with this, and I don't want to answer it again. So I stick to that. Next, maybe how do these surfaces like bow out? The leaf dips. I'm communicating to the viewer that the leaf dips in like this. And so I might add a few contour lines to suggest that. But what if then I added texture that, because I was really, really gung-ho about, I don't know what I was doing, maybe, some haphazard scribbling, if I did this, even you have a lot of, you're creating an illusion and you're telling about the end of different stories simultaneously. Texture, not only because of what I mentioned before, but I'll rush into it without just about all the way construction. You can really take that construction just about all the way, and that's a flower. It helps a lot to have the extra cast shadows separating out your forms, but all these little bits here don't contribute much to our understanding of how these objects sit in space. So add a little bit of texture if you really want to, but don't go overboard with it, and remember that this is not the focus. We're not here to create pretty drawings to pin on our fridge. We're here to learn about how to apply construction. We're not here to learn how to draw flowers and plants. We're using them as an example and as a subject matter by which to practice. I've said it so many times already, but when you're going to reply to it, whether it's wind or the general energy flat, it's going to represent the flow of energy and forces. If that helped, remember above all, I know I've said it so many times already, but when you're creating anything that is flat, it's going to represent the flow of energy and forces that are applied to it, whether it's wind or the general airflow or whatever else. You need to be drawing those flow lines confidently, and you need to abide by them. You can't just draw that flow line for your leaf and then ignore it by, I don't know. You have to follow it, because once you put it down, you've answered that question, you've made this reference image. Next breakdown with step-by-step images of what I'm doing here for this demo, and I'll put that link in the description to accompany this.